Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop Podcast. And today we're going to be talking about EQ from the perspective of mastering. We're going to be talking about the tonal balance of your mix. Because as a mastering engineer, I find that when mixes come in, they usually fall into one of four categories. And there's usually one of four approaches I have to take with each and every master that comes in to my studio. I deal with new masters every day, every week, every month, every year, and countless upon countless singles, albums, EPs that have come in for me to master. There's really almost always I'm doing one of these four things to them. This doesn't mean that I or any good mastering engineer is using presets to do a master. I don't think anyone who's any good takes that kind of approach. But what it does mean is that each mix will be off from the ideal place it should end up in one of four distinctly different ways. And I'm going to talk about what each of these four are, and I think it'll help inform the way that you mix, or if you ever end up doing any mastering, it'll definitely help inform the way that you master. And I think it'll also give you a better sense for what a mastering engineer is really trying to achieve and what you can expect back from a good master if you're getting your tracks mastered by someone else. Even if you're going to try to master your own tracks, I think the ideas in today's episode are going to be super helpful. So what are these four most common EQ curves? These four most common EQ shapes that you'll find on most mixes, even super great high-level mixes? We'll get into all that and a whole lot more in this episode. Before I do, all we need to do is give you the briefest of shout-outs to our sponsors. Our biggest sponsor always is you. If you want to sponsor this podcast, the best way to do it is hit that like button if you're watching the YouTube version, or if you're on Apple Podcasts or something like that, consider giving us a 5-star rating and review. It really does help. But the best way you can sponsor this podcast is by sponsoring yourself. Try one of our great full-length courses like Mastering Demystified, which you can get over at masteringdemystified.com, where I teach you everything that I know about mastering. Or if you're ready for a mixing breakthrough, try out Mixing Breakthroughs over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. That will help you mix faster, more confidently, and more creatively than ever before. Your time to finish mixes is going to go way down while the quality of your mixes goes way up. Is that possible? Not only is it possible, but really possibly the most surefire way to get better at mixing is to start mixing faster by developing and using a system for mixing. That's what we go into in Mixing Breakthroughs. It's all about getting you a system, a roadmap for mixing, so you know exactly what to do and you have a clear, repeatable process that you can apply again and again, which ironically, frees you up to be even more creative. Check that out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Last but not least, quick shout outs to this week's sponsors, SoundToys, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning, making my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Also, another sponsor this week, FabFilter, making some of my other favorite plugins. Each one of them a total workhorse that you can use on almost anything, that are some extremely flexible and often very transparent plugins as well. All right, more about those guys later. Let's get right into the meat of today's topic. What do I mean about there being different frequency shapes or EQ shapes that are extremely common that come up again and again in mastering? Well, I'll tell you right off the bat that probably the majority of mixes that come in for mastering that are mixed reasonably well, maybe even as high as 70% of them, come into mastering a little darker than a final master wants to end up. This is totally normal. So if you find that you're mixing, your chops have been improving, or even you're just feeling like you're getting fairly good at it, but your mixes sound a little dark compared to some of your favorite releases when you A/B them or listen to references, again, some of your favorite records that are out there, if your mixes sound just a tiny bit dark, a tiny bit dull, a tiny bit muffled, a tiny bit congested, a little bit too full in the lower mids, that is totally normal. Probably something like 70% of mixes from good mixing engineers come in that way and get brightened up a little bit in mastering. So that's one potential frequency shape where a mix comes in, where that mix is coming in slightly dark compared to the ideal. Now, what is the ideal? Some people will throw out at you, well, kind of pink noise. Music is supposed to look a little bit on a frequency analyzer like pink noise, where it's gently sloping downwards from lows to highs, and it has this kind of downward curve. And there's some truth to that, but if you really look at all of your favorite releases on a frequency analyzer, pretty much none of them look exactly like pink noise. They'll have little humps and bumps in different places. Sometimes those humps and bumps are good, and they're what give that particular mix or master its character and its personality. So although in mastering we are looking to get rid of bad resonances, it doesn't mean we necessarily want to smooth out every hump and bump. But what will often happen is at the mixing stage, and I think this is because when people mix, they're often spending 4 hours, 8 hours, a day, 2 days, sometimes 2 weeks or more mixing one song. It's kind of fatiguing to listen to a song for that long as bright as it wants to end up in mastering. And even more importantly than that, when you're focusing on mixing, you should be focusing on the mixing part of mixing, the things that can only be done during the mix, making sure the volume relationships between different elements are appropriate, making sure that the emotional arc of the song is getting enhanced, which is the most important thing, not the sound of your kick drum, as much as I love cool sounding kick drums. Now, this is not to say that all mixes fall into this category, number one, of being a little bit too dark, but they're the most common, so we'll lead with that. So what does this mean? Often in mastering, probably the most common thing, not an all the time thing, but probably the most common thing is a mastering engineer might take out a little bit of low mid-range, might add a little bit of upper mid-range or a little bit of brightness and high frequency. And in a lot of cases, people who are mixing maybe aren't hearing full extension into their subs. So there might be additional stuff below 100 hertz, 80 hertz, 60 hertz that are a little hot, just a little bit overwhelming in the lows compared to final commercial releases. So some of that stuff might get tucked back a little bit. If they're not, those excess lows could end up being the only thing triggering the compressors and limiters that a mastering engineer might use. But just because this is the most common thing doesn't mean it's the only thing. In fact, as a mixer myself, when I was getting further along in mixing and getting better and better at it, and my final mixes came out sounding closer and closer to references, sounding closer and closer to commercial releases that I loved, sometimes really inexpensive, not especially good mastering engineers would get a hold of these mixes and just blindly apply this approach of taking out some low mids, boosting some upper mids, boosting some highs, maybe tightening the lows a little bit, and it would sound way worse because my mixes didn't need to get brighter. They did not fall into that category. And sometimes there are some really good mixers who send stuff to me where if I went through this approach that works on a lot of projects that you get in, I would make it sound worse. Some mixes just don't need to get brighter. So that's probably the most common thing where mastering engineer might be reducing some low mids, might be boosting some upper mids, boosting some high frequencies, and the low frequencies maybe bringing them into some additional control. A slightly related one here is mixes that are mid-rangey. This is slightly different than being too dark in the respect that it might not have overly amped up low frequencies. A really mid-rangey mix might be lacking in both extreme highs and extreme lows. So I don't put it in exactly the same category as dark. This to me is just a subtly different twist on the dark mix that comes in. One that is dark on top, but is also light on bottom. So in these, the mastering engineer might go in instead of starting by maybe dialing down the lows a little bit and brightening things up elsewhere, might be trying to find what low frequencies can we enhance here? Do we need to bring up the subs more? Do we need to bring out the upper bass more? Why is it feeling just a little anemic in the lows compared to this artist or this producer's favorite records? What can we do to bring some weight and bottom back into it while we also take care of the darkness that's going on top? So those two together, fairly common. But just because a lot of mixes that come in for mastering are dark doesn't mean all of them are. And just because a lot of mixes, maybe the majority, need some brightening, some excitement, some enhancement that way, doesn't mean all of them need it. And back when I was mixing and I was getting further and further along in it and starting to get better and better at it, my mixes didn't have that problem of being too dark. And there's a lot of people who are really great at mixing today who send me records where they're not too dark. And if you just went ahead and took this approach and just kind of blindfolded yourself and said, oh, most mixes need some reduction in lows and low mids and a little bit of brightening up on top, and you did that to some mixes, you'd make them worse. So just because this is the most common doesn't mean it's the only thing. And there are some great mixes that come into mastering that barely need anything. But when they do need something, it's going to be a subtle version of one of these 4 approaches, one of these 4 EQ curves, one of these 4 general shapes, overall tonal balance that you find in a mix. So we've talked about 2, the slightly too dark mix and the kind of mid-rangey mix. Number 3 is something that is happening more often these days, but it's still not as common as the others, and that is mixes that are a little bit too bright. And these are mixes where the mastering engineer is going to need to do the exact opposite of what we were just talking about. Here, the game might be finding frequencies in the upper mid-range, or maybe the highs that are a little overrepresented, and just dialing them down a little bit. And I've actually been finding that this is occurring a little bit more frequently these days than the past, particularly because, how things should sound kind of goes in cycles. There's fashions to how bright and how dark things should be. More recently, someone like Billie Eilish comes up as a reference for certain types of artists a lot these days, and some of her more recent records are a little bit on the dark side, where the top end is just a little bit softer and a little bit more controlled, and the bottom end is a little bit bigger, and that can be totally cool too. So one of the biggest things that a mastering engineer and a producer needs to think about when it comes to the final release and what it should sound like is the context that this music is going into. If I go listen to some really bright early 90s indie rock records as a reference when the thing that the artist is actually listening to is really dark and full, obviously that's not going to help me. I'm going to take it in the wrong direction. So getting on the same page, producer, artist, mixing engineer, mastering engineer, getting on the same page for how a record should end up is absolutely huge. And that requires people listening to the same music and getting the same general references and same context into their ears. But this is something that I really like to do to records when I'm asked to make them sound really dark and smooth and full. It can be a lot of fun. And how to do that without sacrificing clarity and articulation and presence and excitement. And that's always an interesting puzzle and a really rewarding one too. But the biggest thing is figuring out where the current mix is and in which direction it needs to go. Because if I'm given a really dark set of references for mastering, there's a chance that the mix that I'm given actually needs to be brightened up to sound like those relatively dark references. Similarly, if I'm given what I think are some fairly bright and clear sounding references, there's a chance that the mix I've been given is even brighter than those and needs to be darkened down a little bit to get there. So the biggest thing is knowing where we want to end up, but also knowing where we are and what the relationship between those two are. And that's where these frequency shapes and frequency curves come in. So we've talked about 3 different shapes. The last one, and this one is becoming increasingly common, and it's actually one of the harder ones to deal with. And this is overly hyped sounding mixes or overly scooped sounding mixes. So scooped meaning kind of like a smiley face, where the mixer has done a lot of the stuff that makes records sound bigger and more exciting and more impressive, really amping up lows, really amping up highs and upper mids. And they've almost done an exaggerated version of what a mastering engineer might do to a conventional mix. And they've done that exaggerated version at the mixing stage and potentially gone a little bit too far with it. And they end up in a world where it's not exciting, but they've overshot the mark. And now we need to reel back in some of that hype to get it sounding more like some of their favorite records. This is something I find is actually one of the biggest problems for rock records, because sometimes we're listening to references in the studio that don't make sense for our actual record. If you go ahead and try to chase the sound of a hip-hop record or an EDM record when you're doing a guitar-focused rock record and you're saying, oh, that EDM record, it sounds so hyped up. How do I get my rock record to sound more like that? All of a sudden, you create this rock record and you put it next to your actual favorite rock records that you expect to be listening to this record against, and you expect your end listeners to listen to this record against, and all of a sudden, it's way off the mark from what rock records are supposed to sound like. And this is something that I've found happening more and more often, where I get some rock records and then have these really big amped up kick drums, really bright, clear top end. And then I listen to them next to the artist's favorite records, and it's like, this sounds nothing like Queens of the Stone Age. That's not what those records sound like. Or this sounds nothing like Metallica or Aerosmith or AC/DC or the Pixies or Nirvana or Soundgarden or whoever it is. And I need to go in there and say, well, I can give them a bunch of mix notes and they can try to remix it if they actually want to feel like they're in the same world as all of these real favorite releases of theirs. Or I can do a somewhat significant mastering job where I try to bring the mid-range forward. And almost invariably, something interesting happens here, where when I bring the mid-range forward and I try to control the lows and the highs a little bit more and de-hype things slightly, almost invariably, the guitars come forward. The drums take a little bit of a back seat, and things just sound kind of crunchier and more aggressive and kind of coming at you a little bit more in a nice and fat way. And people are like, oh, why didn't I mix it like that? Here I was trying to make things sound more impressive, but now it actually sounds like the records we like to listen to because I went in and brought some of that mid-range back that they had gotten rid of by trying to make everything sound hyped up and impressive. Now, it's time for the caveats. Those four things are basically always going to be what happens in mastering to a larger or smaller degree. Either the mix is a little dark overall and you want to control lows, low mids, maybe bring out upper mids and highs. Maybe the mix is a little bit mid-rangey. So in addition to bringing out upper mids or highs, we're also maybe bringing up some bottom. We're kind of hyping it. We're kind of bringing in some of that smiley curve that maybe isn't there, that wants to be there. Then there's the third thing where things are just a little too bright and tick-tacky and we need to use EQ, but also other processors, dynamics processors and saturators to kind of make things sound a little fatter, a little fuller, a little smoother, a little richer. Or things can be so hyped up that they're missing some of the mid-range, some of the heart and soul of the record, some of the body and personality of the record, and some of that stuff needs to be brought back in and needs to be slightly de-hyped to the point where maybe it sounds a little less impressive in a quick sip test, but it actually sounds better and more appropriate when you listen to the track as a whole. The way that I'm talking about it right now, I'm making some of these changes sound very significant. And in some mastering jobs, changes can be fairly significant. If a master really needs boosts and cuts of 2 dB and 3 dB and even 4 dB, that is something that I can and will do. But there are some records where it's just barely being pushed in one of these directions, and the EQ changes might be a half a dB and a dB, and that might be the most that's ever done. But even in the case where you're only adjusting at most an EQ of a half dB, one of these four overall shapes is probably what's occurring underneath. And it really is about finding out two things. It's not just about where the mix is, and it's not just about where the mix wants to end up. It's about both those things together and the relationship between the two of them. So there could be a mix that is darker than average that wants to stay darker than average. So we don't want to take the brightening approach. And if anything, maybe we're going slightly darker still in one area. Or maybe we're adding a little bit more hype to it, bringing up lows and highs and tucking back the mid-range. Or maybe we're doing the opposite. Maybe the lows and highs are hyped enough, but we're missing some personality in the mid-range that needs to come forward. So it's not just about where the mix is on average compared to other records in general. It's about where the mix is compared to the records that the artist, the producer, and end listeners actually love the sound of that's relevant to this record. And these EQ curves are about bridging the gap between those two things. Well, I hope this one made sense to you. I hope it was useful. Do you think I'm wrong? Do you think I missed anything with these four general directions that a mix will end up going in mastering? Do you think there's a fifth one? I guess the only fifth one I can think of is you don't touch it at all, because if you EQ it any, you're going to break it because it's already so awesome. And those, to me, are sometimes the hardest masters to do, because it's like, hey, you got to pay me anyway. I couldn't really make it better because you're so great. Now give me money. It's always a hard ask, but sometimes that's the right thing for the project, and sending it to a worse mastering engineer would mean sending it to the person who's going to try to do a whole bunch of stuff to it when nothing should be done. But beyond that, I can't think of any others. Can you? Let me know if you can. Let me know if this way of thinking about things is useful to you. Let me know in the comments down below, and also let me know Which of these directions do your mixes usually end up having to go in mastering? Has a mastering engineer or a automated mastering service ever gotten it wrong for you and gone in the exact opposite direction of where you think it should have wound up? I want to hear about it in the comments down below, or you can email me over at podcast@sonicscoop.com if you prefer to shoot me an email. Big thanks and shout out again to you for making it this long into the episode. If you liked hearing me talk for this long, you're totally weird, which means I totally like you, which means you totally might like one of my courses. Check out Mastering Demystified if you want to learn everything that I know about mastering and hear changes like these in real time. It's got a 30-day money-back guarantee. You can get it at masteringdemystified.com. We'll teach you everything you need to know to get started in mastering for yourself, whether it's mastering tracks for others, mastering your own tracks, or even if you're just going to work with a professional mastering engineer for the first time. Check it out, masteringdemystified.com. Also, you can check out our full-length course on mixing over at mixingbreakthroughs.com that will help you mix faster, more creatively, with more confidence and better results than ever before. Get it over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Last but not least, big shout out to this week's sponsors, SoundToys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. They make some of the vibiest and most fun to use plugins out there. Check them out, anything they make for free for 30 days at soundtoys.com. Also, big shout out and thanks to FabFilter, making some of the most flexible, use them anywhere utility plugins, making incredible EQs, compressors, limiters, delays, saturators, and more that do basically everything in a one-stop shop in each and every one of those processor categories. They have GUIs that are both extremely simple and extremely easy to use and extremely deep and powerful at the same time. Check them out over at fabfilter.com. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.